Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Mad Mamluks. I'm Mahin and I'm joined by my co-hosts Sheikh Amir Saeed and Sim. On today's show we welcome a dear friend and brother from across the pond, Dilly Hussain, who is the deputy editor of British Muslim news site 5 Pillars and a political blogger for the Huffington Post UK. This podcast is long overdue. I know we were trying to set something up, seems like for a year, but Dilly, assalamu alaikum, welcome to our show. Real pleasure to have you on today.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers. I'm assuming you left the best till the last, I'm assuming, so maybe that's why it was delayed. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Well, Dilly, we just came off of the strikes in Syria, and you I'm sure have a lot of thoughts on that, and a lot of young Muslims are hoping for the Americans to jump in and save the day. What are your thoughts on that?
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Subhanallah, Syria obviously has now entered its 7th year of the conflict, and personally speaking, I don't think much in terms of Western and Russian policy has changed. Obviously there's the chemical attack in Duna, and obviously it was another supposed quote-unquote red line that was crossed, and so United States along with France and Britain thought they'd carry out strikes and save the day. It actually comes to surface that what they attacked, or what Trump described as the perfect strike, was a chemical depot, which the Russians then said that it was already been evacuated. We need to sometimes move out of our own personal, political, sectarian and partisan reading of not just Syria, but geopolitics and politics in general. And it's a very difficult thing to do because we're insan and we have our own biases, we have our own alliances, we have our own grievances. And I think this whole kind of understanding that America or the West would come save the day in Syria is a farcical idea. Simply because it's been 7 years. The Western powers, namely America and Britain, are already in Syria. And people forget this. They're already in Syria. The American government is already backing the Kurds in the north. And as are the SAS and British intelligence services, they've been in Syria for the last 4 to 5 years. And this kind of selective air raids on certain regime positions is just a tokenistic gesture for America to show, and this, from my opinion, just to flex their muscle as a PR exercise. And another telling example of this would be that under the Obama administration, he created a 70-plus nation anti-ISIS task force. And who are ISIS? ISIS is a criminal militia. But can their death toll really be compared to that of the Assad regime and the Russia? So it just shows that there is a double standard. There's a double standard in having supposed red lines of chemical attacks. We saw this in Ghouta 4 years ago, and we saw it again recently. And unfortunately, the Syrians are pawns and have fallen victim to a much bigger and dirtier chess game that's been played by the regional powers and the colonial masters. And I will include within that as well Turkey and the Gulf states, Iran, Hezbollah, the mercenaries that are coming through to Syria via Pakistan and Afghanistan, and of course Russia, America and France and Britain. So it's a dirty game that's happening, and it's always been the case. But there seems to be one thing that each power seems to unite upon, and they agree on this, that under no circumstances can we allow an quote-unquote Islamist power to replace Assad if he were to fall. There seems to be an ijma, a consensus amongst everyone regarding this issue.
Yeah, among the Americans and the Russians, you're saying. You're saying among the Russians and the Americans, even though they're on the opposite sides, they agree on one thing, that an Islamist government cannot take place, that it's better to deal with the devil you know than the devil you don't know.
Okay, let me ask you guys a question about this, and let me play devil's advocate for a second, if you don't mind. And Dilly, you can continue after this. So, if, as of right now, there's been about 200 chemical attacks in Syria right now. First thing is, why now is America? I know there was one last year, about a year ago in April, also, where America attacked another base of chemicals in Syria, and now it chose a time now, right? Out of all the other times, one thing we have to think on as onlookers, why are they choosing now to, after almost 7 years, to intervene? That's the first thing. The second thing is that we know full well that America has been arming the rebels, right? So, and trying to remove Bashar al-Assad. So doesn't that make it inevitable that some of who they refer to as rebels are now going to come even stronger and more into power? And now Independence News had just released an article, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that there's a lot more weapons directly given to ISIS by America than we actually thought. It wasn't just taken over or ghanima, if you want to say. It was rather directly given to ISIS. So how do we make sense of all of this chaos? Is some of it true? Is some of it not true? Because if Bashar al-Assad is leaving now, he's on his way out, it seems to be, then there's no other choice but Islamists to come into power, right?
Is that the intent of the Americans and their allies to oust Bashar al-Assad of this attacks?
No.
Absolutely not. And I think we need to make it clear right now, as we speak, the situation in Syria is that the Assad regime have the upper hand. He is in no way is he in the losing side at the moment. The momentum of victory is on his side. That said, when you said that, why now? Why has Trump decided to carry out these attacks now? First and foremost, they were very punitive attacks. Let's be frank about this, right? It was a few chemical depots that he decided to attack, which the Russians have said were evacuated. And I believe the death toll was none or very few.
Yeah, that's what happened last year too, right? There were empty spots that they...
There were empty spots, yeah? So, as I mentioned earlier, this appears to be a PR exercise because there's this whole discussion, and one of the major critiques of the Obama administration with regards to his policy in Syria was that he's weak, that he allowed Russia to muscle in. And so Trump has obviously tried countering that, obviously with his sporadic tweets on Twitter saying, yes, the missiles are coming, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, he carried out these punitive strikes. But in reality, these strikes mean very little in terms of shifting the balance of power. And with regards to another comment, I believe one of the brothers there made was, we know that the Americans have been arming the rebels. That statement in of itself, to say in isolation, appears very unequivocal. They have been arming certain elements of the rebels.
Yes.
And which elements are they? They are the elements which they term as the pro-democratic forces. It tends to be the Kurds. It tends to be the kind of quote-unquote Islamists that they can kind of are palatable, that will, according to them, if Bashar was to fall, they will then implement a pluralistic liberal democracy in place of Bashar. But ultimately, the main guys that the Americans are arming and training are the Kurds, who are also the main enemies of the Turks, who also seem to be allies of America, who are also NATO. So it's a dirty game. Syria, at the moment, there are so many different games that are happening, so many different alliances, so many different things happening, that sometimes it's difficult just to realize and recap what the hell is actually going on. So it's best for me, when I look at Syria, I tend to do it like this. What are the ultimate truths? The ultimate truth is that Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia are unequivocal in their support of Assad. With regards to the rebels, they were at the brink of victory in 2014. They were literally at the gates of Damascus in 2014 until, of course, January 2015, ISIS came into the scene. There was a lot of friction within the rebel factions. A number of the Gulf states who were backing certain big rebel groups then pulled the arming and funding. And then you have to understand under whose orders did Qatar, did Saudi, did Turkey, did all these guys lessen their support? Because we know that the Free Syrian Army is essentially with Turkey. We know that Jaish al-Islam was affiliated to Saudi Arabia. We also are aware that Qatar had also its own kind of rebel factions that they were arming and funding. But a lot of this has dried up now. And it was dried up ultimately at the behest of keeping Washington happy. Because it's okay to fund rebel factions who, if they were to remove Bashar, we can still ultimately have our geopolitical interests and our hegemony intact. But if you have a Sunni rebel, Islamist rebel faction that takes over, that is not concerned with becoming a stooge or a proxy state for America, then ultimately we don't need these guys in power.
Right.
So America carrying out these punitive strikes right now means very little. And they are not going to rescue the Syrians. They are ultimately there to prevent and maintain two things. Number one, their own geopolitical interests and their own hegemonic rule. Secondly, if they are going to remove Bashar, they're going to do so with a faction which is powerful and strong enough to remove him in the first place and to, subscribe to whatever America demands. And ultimately, the only guys who are willing to do this are the Kurds, as it stands.
Right.
So
what you're essentially saying is America's plan right now is just to maintain the status quo until a better option comes its way.
But right? Absolutely, because this has been America's quagmire since the beginning of the Syrian revolution. The fact that they've armed and they've funded certain groups, and what ends up happening is that they miscalculate the Islamic sentiment, which seems to be very consistent amongst the vast majority of the rebel factions. Even though it's theologically and sectarianly speaking, there may be some differences, but generally speaking, what made the Syrian revolution distinct to other uprisings that were born out of the Arab Spring is that they were very, very Islamic in their sloganeering, in their propaganda, in the kind of alternative that they were calling for, and this is something that America and the West generally misunderstood. They could not hone in and bring under their control a big Sunni rebel faction who would subscribe to their plan for Syria. And every time they armed a rebel faction, two things would happen. Either those groups would then go on to sell those weapons to the stronger Sunni rebel factions, which America wouldn't sell weapons to. And by the way, there's even questions with regards to whether the CIA did this intentionally, whether they were aware of this. The fact that the weapons that they were selling to the quote-unquote moderate rebel factions, moderate pro-democratic rebel factions, that where these weapons were going to go to the likes of Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, who've renamed themselves now. They knew, there are reports to say that the CIA even knew that these weapons were going to ultimately be sold. Because what good are these weapons to a group which is not influential? So yes, America is interested in maintaining the status quo, destabilizing Syria, because as soon as a Muslim majority country or any country is destabilized, it becomes easier to rule and manipulate and capitalize. And the only thing that seems to be an ijma on, a consensus between all the powers, is that we cannot allow a Sunni Islamist rebel faction who we cannot control, who wants to see a quote-unquote Islamic government to replace Bashar. That seems to be the one thing that they all seem to agree on. Right. The whole kind of chemicals are a red line and you know, genocide and war against crimes against humanity. My dear brothers, we are in the 7th year of the Syrian conflict. More than 500,000 have died. And we're still talking about red lines. Yeah. What difference does it make whether you gas thousands of people to death, or whether you bomb 1,000 people to death, or you shell them to death? You know, this whole kind of chemicals are a red line is an absolute bakwas. And we shouldn't accept this. It appears to be a smokescreen for Western powers to just flex their powers and play a game of PR. If you're going to go in, go in and bomb Bashar and move him. Even though I'm against this. But if you're going to do it, if you're going to deliver on your promises, then move him. But the West, namely America, are not interested in a hot war with Russia. They haven't got the appetite for it. And I don't think Russia has the appetite for it either. So they're going to do what they did in the Cold War, and that is to obviously fund certain factions to do the dirty work for them.
But we're not assuming that they're going to give power to the Peshmerga and the Kurds to take Bashar's place. Obviously, it's just to give them their own state. So they can be influential in their own state, right?
Well, and also be a thorn in the side on Turkey, right?
That's become the reality now. If we're talking 2014-15, there were still talks about removing Bashar, but right now it is to do with give the Kurds the north, give the regime Damascus, Latakia, and other key places in the central towns and cities. And Idlib, unfortunately, seems to be the last remaining stronghold of the Sunni rebels. And if you look at the most recent maps of where all the factions are, Idlib is decreasing and decreasing in size and in control by the day. And I fear that Idlib will be another Halab. So yeah, America are just interested in keeping Syria destabilized and making sure that the Kurds are there to obviously maintain and protect their own geopolitical interests, which then brings in another whole entire new dynamic, and that is the role of Turkey.
Right.
Because Turkey has US bases. Turkey is known to be a key US ally. It's a member of NATO. Erdogan himself praised the recent airstrikes, saying that it was, I forgot the word that he used. I think he said the word he used was either sufficient or proportionate. That's it. He used the word proportionate. He said the US Western strikes were proportionate according to the chemical attacks that was used by the regime against its own people. So it's a messy game, ya Ikhwan.
No, I think, Sim, you brought up something really awesome. Sorry, Sim, you brought up something really awesome, is that not only to give them their own state, but to be a thorn in the side of Turkey, to keep Turkey busy. But one thing is that many people have the question of, is that Turkey and Erdogan claim many instances or show a stance of being anti-American and, challenging America as if they're going to do something, but deep down they're actually allies. Like, how does somebody who doesn't know too much about how the political arena is working, how do they make sense of this?
You see, Turkey is one of those, when you speak about Turkey and specifically Erdogan and the AK party, you have to appreciate, and I'm sure this is probably, I don't know, I'm assuming it probably is the case in America, Erdogan and the AK party have a big support network in the West.
Yes.
Amongst Muslims. He's seen as a reviver. A few people have even referred to him as a mujaddid. And
people think of the whole Ottoman history when they talk about him. Yeah.
But I think we need to be very clear about a few things. And I've spoken to AK party students and the youth wing when I've gone out to Istanbul a number of times. And what they say to me, Dilly, it appears that the supporters of Erdogan outside of Turkey don't actually understand him or his politics. We don't see him as a neo-sultan. We don't see him as a khalif. We don't see him as a savior of the Muslim world. We just see Erdogan as a Muslim ruler of a secular nation state who's battling with Kemalism in his society locally, domestically, and internationally, he's just playing a very good game of rhetoric. He does have care and concern, but he can do very little because the military is ultimately still run by the Kemalists, right? But you go outside of Turkey and you speak to those who support Erdogan, they'll say, no, mashallah, he is a sincere ruler, he is the best of the worst, and all these kind of things.
The half of the Quran.
Erdogan in his own words has said that he will uphold the founding principles and values of Kemal Ataturk. He himself has said to Al Arabiya 6 to 7 months ago that he has absolutely no interest in establishing Sharia. He has absolutely no interest in establishing Khilafah. That secularism, as understood by the Turks, is in no contradiction with the Sharia. Now, with all this in mind, you have to understand that Erdogan is a fantastic politician. His rhetoric is fantastic. And ultimately, it boils down to two things. Either he is powerful and influential enough to do something, but he's not doing it, or he's actually not powerful and influential enough to make any military decisions. Now, whichever avenue you go down, it'd be incorrect to think that Erdogan is in a position to make grandiose decisions and moves in Syria. Because if he can do it, but he's not doing it, then this is a case of treachery and inaction. But if he can't do it, but he's claiming and he's giving it the big talk, then that would be quote-unquote political taqiyya.
He seems to be very good in stirring emotions of Muslims that are looking for some type of savior. He seems like he hits that note and strikes that chord in Muslims very well. If I can backtrack, yes. you mentioned something that some people may have issues with. I want to know why you said this, for whatever. You said that you wouldn't want America to bomb Bashar al-Assad. Right? And you said you wouldn't like that to happen, right?
Yeah.
Why would you say something like that?
Because I oppose any Western military intervention in the Muslim majority world, no matter how bad the situation is on the ground.
All right.
Because I believe the key duty of any Muslim majority land where people are occupied and oppressed and bombarded, it is the duty of the neighboring Muslim countries to fulfill their duty and their responsibility to intervene for the sake of Islam and their brotherhood. It is not the duty of America, France, Britain, China, Russia to come busy themselves in the affairs of the Muslim world. We should have learnt this from the period of colonialism. We should have learnt this after the two world wars. We should have learnt this by the formation of the United Nations and with these 5 permanent members of the Security Council, these 5 countries that perceive themselves as the policemen of the world. It is they who ultimately created, right? And there's this kind of mindset that when you speak to some of our Muslim brothers and sisters, especially those that come from a bit of an older generation, we're always blaming the West. We're always blaming the West. No, we're not blaming the West. It's just reminding you of history.
Right.
Those straight lines that you see in Africa and in the Middle East and in the Arabian Peninsula, they were created by European men, drank of shandy during or towards the end of the World War I. And it is that colonization of those artificial borders of the nation states, which is the core cause of many of the problems that we find ourselves in today, especially with regards to North Africa and Middle East. And we can even argue the same applies to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh to some degree, right? I do not want, and I'm unequivocally against any Western country, any Western non-Muslim country to bomb or militarily intervene in any Muslim majority land. It is the duty of the neighboring Muslim countries to come into the aid of their brothers and sisters.
But a lot of people will tell you, Dilly, that those countries will, in effect, act as proxies, even like how Saudi Arabia is right now involved with the rebel groups, but they're really just funneling CIA weapons to the rebels in Syria. So a lot of people say, by in effect, anyway, even if Muslim countries do get involved, they're working on the behalf of the U.S. government or whatever colonial power is that they serve.
So that then will nicely lead us to then discuss if it's a case where Muslim majority countries and their respective armies will not intervene until it fulfills a particular agenda that's been dictated by the White House or 10 Downing Street, then we need to then have the next discussion is how do we, at least from what we can do, change that reality? What can we as the awam, as the ordinary folk, as the mad Mamluks, as Dilly Hussain, as whoever we are, how can we at least contribute towards changing that reality? Now, we don't have guns, ships, wars, planes, and tanks. We don't. I'm sure if I had it, or if Sheikh Amr had it, or if Imran had it, or if you guys had it, or Munir had it, if any of you guys had it, I'm sure, inshallah, we can make those changes. But we don't. You know, we have a pen, we have a podcast, we have a mouth, we've got some kind of exposure. We then need to discuss why is it that Muslim majority countries fail to intervene in the aid of their brothers and sisters? Is ultimately because they are ultimately proxy states. They're satellite states for their colonial masters. If that's the case, then we then need to discuss how do we change this paradigm? How do we change this framework? And it ultimately boils down to, or one of the key things that it boils down to, is the construct of the nation state and how they were built and created, and how the deep state and how these regimes operate, and how they were ultimately founded, and how they're being preserved. And these are very deep questions we need to discuss and on every level of Muslim society. You know, we have Western political thinkers who are talking about the decline and the downfall of the nation state, and yet sadly you'd find within Muslim communities we are here upholding these very constructs. So yeah, I mean you're right. Yes, they're proxy states. So even when they do intervene, they intervene either for their own national interests or to fulfill a particular agenda that's been dictated by their colonial masters. Then in that case, if we all accept that's the truth, then we then need to have the other conversation, which is how do we change this? Or do we just sit here doing diddly squat?
Well, should we also consider I don't know, you have some expertise on this, the end of the Ottoman Empire, what actually happened internally, what was our state, and maybe look at the last 100, 200 years and see the trend, what happened, and understand why we don't have the Ottoman Empire anymore, or a caliphate example, right? And because if okay, so let me ask you this: hypothetically speaking, if the Ottoman Empire existed today, how do you think a lot of this? How would the world look? Could you superimpose that theoretically?
Okay, so obviously you have to appreciate you're asking a hypothetical scenario, but I'll give you I'll tell you my envisagement of what I would believe if an Ottoman state or an Islamic polity which transcended borders existed. Let's just say that. But forget the Ottomans.
That went beyond the nation state model.
If we had an Islamic polity which transcended borders, which did not recognize the nation state construct, which gave more precedence to the Islamic identity and that of brotherhood, then I rest assured that many of the conflicts that we're seeing today would not exist. because those powers would then think twice. And even the Ottoman Empire, the Uthmani Khilafah, in its concluding 50 to 150 years, when it was at its most weakest, which is the beginning of the 19th century, right up until the end of World War I, Western powers, as much as they still perceived the Ottomans as relatively weak, they still thought twice before they intervened or caused trouble. Bar Russia, Britain and France's conflict with the Ottomans became overt during World War I. Prior to that, France was always renowned for it being the traditional ally of the Ottomans, and Britain had a different tariqah in dealing with the Ottomans. It'd be more to do with conspiring and instigating Christian missionaries, nationalist factions within the empire. It was only Russia that had, for about 150 years, all-out war. But even then, they still feared the Ottomans. They still feared the Ottomans, and most specifically, Sultan Abdul Hamid, rahimahullah, they feared this man. They feared him because he was the last great Khalif who exerted the importance of the Ummah uniting behind one Khalif, to the extent where Abdul Hamid was very pivotal in the mutiny of 1857. He played a pivotal role. He played a pivotal role in many of the resistant movements in the Indian subcontinent. Many of the Deobandi movements that had resisted the British, Abdul Hamid was corresponding with them. So if such a polity was to exist today, I would say that some of these wars and some of these cases of outright unadulterated dhulm wouldn't exist, because to have such a polity, to have such a superpower would kind of change the whole dynamics of global politics.
And even if the superpower was weak, Ustad, even if the superpower was weak, it's still there's still a voice for the ummah that says, hey, you know what? Don't mess with these brothers. Don't mess with these sisters. At least that voice, even if it was a weak entity, right? So, and I think that's a very, very important point. Now, again, I'm sorry to keep backtracking, but you mentioned something, and many people mention something to this degree. You mentioned something very, very proactive. You said that what can we do from over here, whether it's a podcast, whether it's Dilly Hussain from 5 Pillars. What is it? Step number 1. What do you think it is that we can do? Because we don't want to leave this question. This is a very, very important question. We can't just leave it up in the air, right? Even if it's very simple, people are looking for a solution, whether they're living in a village or they're living in a city. They're seeing what's happening and they say, hey, what can I do? I know there's chaos. I know there's stooges all around the world of imperial powers. There's no way we can go against them. We don't believe in armed struggle. We don't believe in violence. But we want to do something. And we want it to really, really hit home in the most proactive and sensical way, right? So how can we do this, starting from step 1, which will lead us to step 2, basically?
We need to look no further when we're talking about the ordinary lay people who come from different respective backgrounds in terms of profession and academia or whatever it may be. We're ultimately talking about the Abduls and the Aminas of the Ummah who, as I mentioned earlier, don't control armies and ships and planes and tanks and stuff. We know from our Islamic source texts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam are very clear with regards to how we deal with these kind of issues. Number 1, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He has raised us as the best nation amongst mankind because we enjoin in good and forbid evil, and we believe in Allah. We also know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that who is better than speech than the one who does righteous deeds and calls to Allah and says, indeed I am of the Muslims. We also know the hadith where Prophet Muhammad says that when you see a munkar, change it with your hands. If you can't change it with your hands, speak out against it. And the lowest form of iman is to hate it from within. And I don't know that there is no one that can just do less than hate from within. And the evidences are many. Even from the hadith from I believe it's at Tirmidhi or Musnad Ahmad Sheikh, please correct me if I'm wrong, when one of the companions asked Rasulullah what is the best form of jihad, and the Prophet ﷺ responded, Kalimatul Haqq, the word of truth to a tyrannical ruler. So the evidences, there's a plethora of these evidences. That just because we don't own, just because the layman may not have access to or may not influence certain policies, we still have our own respective means. We still have access to the internet. We have access to family members. We have access to friends and families who may have access to more people. So at the very least, we need to talk about these issues. We need to talk about
it. So step number one is raising awareness, basically.
Raising awareness, yes. We need to talk about these
now,
things.
Someone can say raising awareness, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Someone can say raising awareness is just going to charge people up, but they're still not able to really do anything, right? Because we're talking about huge international powers, right?
So, what is this? I don't accept this kind of defeatist mentality. You're just talking about it. You're going to vent on Facebook and forget about it with your daily life. Alhamdulillah, at least that sentiment is there. At least that sentiment to talk about it is there.
But how is that convincing the Muslim powers and changing their mind? What is that? Where's that transition occurring?
Because once these kind of discussions become mainstream, once these discussions start happening at every level of society, then regimes and governments have no choice but to either listen or then suppress these ideas and discourse. That's the only two things that will end up happening. Either the governments will have to listen, including those sincere elements, if there are any, within the current construct of the Muslim majority world, or they will, as we've seen in the Arab world and other parts of the Muslim world, they'll just try to suppress these ideas.
Well, they will try to suppress them, and they will send them into their dungeons and their chambers, and someone can say, hey, this will just lead to another civil war, like that happened with the Arab Spring, and it's just going to be more Muslims killed, because when there's ideas that they want for change, for the government to change, especially if they're Islamic in nature, the government is going to lash out and be even more oppressive with an iron fist against the Muslims, and that's going to lead to some bad reactions and another civil war, right?
But couldn't we say the Arab Spring was more of like a nationalistic movement than for the sake of Islam?
No, of course, absolutely. I kind of disagree with this kind of whole painting of the Arab Spring as an Islamic spring. Of course, there were Islamic movements and groups involved.
They utilized the opportunity, yes.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. But ultimately, we had left-leaning students. It was a very you had huge elements that were very pro-democratic. But ultimately, I think we can agree on one thing. The Arab Spring was a reflection and a manifestation of what the Ummah can do. It's what they can do. Now, obviously, there was no consistent and unified voice. And it was just a case of people asking for their rights within the framework of Islam, and the basic rights. The ability to have access to employment, education, the bare necessities that one needs to survive, right? It wasn't about khilafah. It wasn't about establishing an Islamic state. It wasn't about, even in many cases, fighting the regime. It wasn't. It was just millions of people who took to the street because they were, quite frankly, fed up with the status quo.
And they wanted to be as peaceful as possible too, yeah.
Pardon?
And they wanted to be as peaceful as possible too.
Absolutely. Look at Egypt. The Egyptians, Libyans, Tunisians, even the Syrians. The Syrians didn't want to raise arms. How did the whole thing kick off in Syria? It happened because the regime turned its guns to its people.
Yes.
Right? And it started shooting its own people. And then obviously you had defections from the Syrian army, because there were many, many Sunnis who just quite frankly refused to kill their own brothers and sisters. So they defected. And then you had the formation of the Free Syrian Army. But every single one of these uprisings or revolutions were all peaceful, and they were unarmed. But the whole question, and obviously Sheikh is there with us, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, and please, I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, because sometimes I just blabber on, and obviously I will say things based on my limited reading and understanding, and especially when I've got esteemed brothers like you guys in my presence. If you're going to go out and obviously, the chants Ashab, Yurid, Isqat al-Nidam, and obviously calling for the downfall of the regime, which in actuality meant that we want major reforms, a change of the regime, maybe just government, etc. If that government or regime then now starts killing its own people, its unarmed civilians, and there is a genuine threat of your family being attacked or your neighborhood being attacked, one could even argue that it's further line to defend your property and your women.
Of course.
Right? So maybe the Syrians had no other choice but when they realized that the regime were quite clear about how they were going to put down these uprisings, maybe they had to pick up arms. And so the Arab Spring is a manifestation and an example of what the Ummah can do, its potential, what it can do. But what ended up happening and what we're seeing now is what happens when there isn't a unified voice, or whether there isn't a clear end goal or objective, because through disunity and division it's easier to manipulate and for outside powers to manipulate. We saw this in Egypt.
Of course.
We saw that Muhammad Morsi, may Allah hasten his release and make it easy for him and our brothers from the Ikhwan. I mean, and we saw what happened with him, the first democratically elected president of Egypt, barely there for a year.
What a joke.
Sisi initially backed him, and now we know about Washington's role in actually, backing that coup, right?
Yeah.
So we've seen what happens when a quote-unquote revolution or a movement for change, when it's divided and inconsistent in what it wants as its end objective, it's much more easy to manipulate and fund certain elements against other elements and cause fitna and fasad, which happened in the Arab Spring. I mean,
if you're divided and conquered, it's a lot
it was a cosmetic removal. When I look at the Arab Spring, I saw it as cosmetic change. Yes, Ben Ali fell, Ali Abdullah Saleh fell, Gaddafi was killed. These things happened. Mubarak fell, but the regimes remained.
Yes,
the deep state remained. So these were cosmetic changes. But the very same guys and the very same regimes and the very same entities that kind of consolidate this kind of system of oppression is still there. Go ask an Egyptian now, what's the situation of buying bread now? It's terrible. Right? They can so some of them don't even have bread. So the Arab Spring was a beautiful thing when it began. It's just very sad the way things turned out. But I'm an optimist because ultimately this is from the Sunnah, and I see it as there was lots of hope, and there still is hope, because I think that when the Arab world found out what it could do, I don't think that they would fully accept a regime or a rule which they had experienced and tolerated for 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah. But I think the main silver lining that came from even the collapse of the Arab Spring was that it proved to all the Islamist movements, everyone across the board, from Ikhwan to all the North African movements that are working to bring Islam into the government, that gradualism doesn't work. That gradualism is a failure in itself, in the sense that you are trying to change a system that will not allow itself to fail. You know what I'm saying?
So not only that, every system has its goal, right? And that system itself, if you're trying to gradualize, if you want to say, it's only going to make you more of promoting its system itself, right? The higher up you get, the more you're going to be promoting that system.
Now, when you go to the Arab world and you talk to any of the brothers from the Ikhwan, they will tell you point blank that they no longer believe in the way of the elder Ikhwan from the previous generation on how to work their way into power through politics. It's no more now. I mean, they don't necessarily want to pursue the path of ISIS where they're like maniacally violent or that, but they are considering armed struggle against the government, right? So I mean that's also the other way that they want to operate.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, my dear brothers, the term Islamist is a term which I personally reject. So it's one of those terms which I personally refrain from using, and when I do, I always put in inverted commas whether I'm writing or speaking. But I know what we mean. You know what I mean. We're basically talking about Islamic political movements, or movements or groups that want to bring Islam into government and public life. Can we agree on that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, khair. With regards to our brothers from Ikhwan al-Muslimin, I think it's very important to understand that they are not one monolithic movement. That they vary and they are different in. So let's say the Ikhwan of Egypt is different to the Ikhwan of Syria, which is different to Ikhwan of Egypt, to different to the Ikhwan of Morocco and other parts of North Africa. Because, for example, during the Arab Spring, the Ikhwan of Jordan didn't want to overthrow the king. They just wanted him to make some very minor reform. They were pro-monarchy in Jordan, whereas the Ikhwan in Syria have got far more, and Egypt have a far more violent and bloodier relationship with the government. You have to also understand that the Ikhwan is a movement, and movements change. Political parties don't change their manifesto or their founding ideas, but movements do change. So if we look at the very inception of the movement under Hassan al-Banna rahimahullah, where it was a lot to do with grassroots dawah, changing the hearts and minds of the people on a grassroots level, building certain institutions and services for the ummah, so their confidence in Islam becomes more. Then when we start moving towards the 50s, 60s, under the teaching of Sayyid Qutb rahimahullah, where it was far more overtly resistance related, far more militaristic, militaristic. There's a strong focus on jihad fi sabilillah, as well as the illegitimacy of the regime. And obviously after the assassination of Anwar al-Sadat, then the Ikhwan in the late 70s, early 80s kind of then started realize that, okay, grassroots dawah may not have worked. Armed struggle clearly didn't work. So I guess we just have to see what we can do from the ballot box. Obviously, that's a very simplified chronology of the Ikhwan, but ultimately that's what happened. And you're right, when you speak to some of our brothers from the Ikhwan, they don't actually see a conflict or any kind of contradiction between the democratic system of the nation state and establishing Islam via that system. Now, I'm going to be careful as to how I word this, because they are dear brothers. They are our brothers, and their intentions and the sentiments are the same. But ultimately, they follow an ijtihad or an idea or a way which, quite frankly, I disagree with, and I can't understand it. I can't understand how you can have an Islamic democratic nation state. I can't understand how you can implement Sharia, forget about in totality, but even aspects of the Sharia, for a pluralistic democratic system. You are trying to ultimately establish the deen of Islam within a paradigm and within a political framework which is ajib to us, one which our theology and our history has never really understood. And this was one of the diseases which affected the Ottoman Empire, the Uthmani Khilafah. They couldn't understand and fathom the idea of nationalism. Yani, what is this nationalism? What, borders based on what? These kind of ambiguous national and cultural values. This was something that was very strange. So our brothers from Ikhwan al-Muslimin, so just to conclude on this point, they are not one monolithic movement. They differ according to which region and which country you're talking about, number one. Number two, as any movement, and I'm not saying obviously the Ikhwan, I'm not likening them to the feminist movement, but movements change ideas. They diversify. They kind of move with the times. It generally tends to be the nature of movements, which is distinctly different to political parties. And therefore, they've according to them, they've tried and tested certain strategies before, which according to them and those metrics of measuring success have failed. From grassroots dawah, even though that's still, they're still doing that, mashallah, tabarakallah, to obviously armed struggle. And I think the key turning point was the assassination of Anwar al-Sadat and obviously the execution of a number of key Ikhwani leaders. And obviously when they then became ultimately pro-ballot box, it became very difficult to understand how Islam would establish itself through a nation-state democratic system. But when you speak to some of our brothers, or you read some of the works of Yusuf al-Qaradawi and others, or when I've spoken to key brothers and activists from the Ikhwan in the UK, our conversations have usually always, it's never gone beyond the compatibility of Islam as a comprehensive system to liberal democracy or the nation state. Because I've always maintained the position that the two are loggerheads. Muslims for sure can live and survive under a liberal democratic nation state. Muslims can survive under any polity, any state structure. But to establish Islam in totality, I can't see how a pluralistic democratic system would allow that.
Well, to the Western mind, Ustad, to the Western mind, someone will say that, well, Islam is a very democratic religion. Everyone has a say and everyone has a right. So if you're saying that you don't want democracy, what is this going to be? This is going to be, iron fist again, but in Islamicized way. That's just what happens to
they think it's theocratic government. Yeah, exactly. Where people.
So like, wait, what are you saying? You just want one person to call all the shots and all of us live under oppression? What's the difference now between us and that and Hosni Mubarak then, for instance?
No.
Right?
I think it's very important, first and foremost, and I've had this conversation with a number of non-Muslims, namely academics and kind of progressive activists, is that first and foremost, please do not conform Islamic Sharia or Islamic politics with the framework of the nation state. We do not fit Islamic politics within the confines of the nation state or a liberal democratic paradigm. No, that's you trying to understand Islamic politics through the prisms of the nation state.
Yes.
So we say no. Just because there was a shura council in electing a khalif does not mean shurocracy. quite frankly. It doesn't mean that. That was a huge leap from a council of Sahaba, giving their thoughts or electing a ruler, or certain tribes come and giving the bay'ah, to now saying that this is all of a sudden the modern manifestation of it means it's a democracy, it's a shirocracy. Quite frankly, I reject that. It's a huge leap, it's a huge jump. That's the first thing. Secondly, as Muslims, when we're discussing these ideas and these concepts and these arguments, we need to be very careful that when we talk about Islamic politics or an entity or a polity which is Islamic in nature, which will, and let's be quite frank about this and quite unadulterated about this, and this has always been maintained by the likes of Imam al-Mawardi rahimahullah, Imam Shatibi rahimahullah, and many of the giants in our history, that the policy of a dawla, of an Islamic state, is ultimately jihad fi sabilillah as a foreign policy. If dawah to your neighboring lands there's an obstacle. To remove that obstacle, you need to carry out jihad fi sabilillah. So jihad and dawah is ultimately interchangeable. They're two things. Now, how you articulate these concepts and these ideas to a non-Muslim or a Muslim who doesn't understand these, you need to obviously be very careful, because obviously there's certain laws in certain countries as to how you articulate these things, and if you don't articulate it properly, you can't get yourself into trouble. But secondly, it boils down to this: we cannot confine Islamic politics and the Sharia into the confines of the nation state. So when you say, it's either liberal democracy or it's a tyranny or an autocracy, no, that
or
is
socialism.
That's a spectrum. That's a spectrum that you've created. That's a spectrum that I was taught when I did my politics BA. That it's either liberal democracy or an autocracy or a tyranny or an authoritarian government. No, it doesn't have to. That's according to Western paradigms and understandings of politics. No, it doesn't work like that. So when we talk about Muslims' desire to see such a polity where it's one ruler or one Khalif, and these lands to be unified, and I'd quite frankly just say, well, look, hold on. If Europe can unite after 2 world wars, right? In what we know as the European Union, and the Muslim world has never ever seen such wars like World War I and World War II's, then political unity is something that's most definitely on the tables. You can never rule that out. How can you say that?
No,
Yes.
go ahead. Sorry.
How can we say that Europe has the ability to unite in the formation of European Union? Now, obviously, there's a whole discussion about Brexit and populist right-wing groups now wanting to get out of the European Union. But the fact is, Europe still managed to unite after 2 of the worst wars in human history. And they still managed to unite, and they still managed to have shared values or shared policies, shared military and economic efforts. If they can do it, and the Europeans have no history of such unity, yet we have 11 to 1200 centuries of a track record of some level, a strong level of political unity which transcended borders. How can we say one is a realistic option and one is just a dream? But just to conclude on this point, I think it's very important also that we need to be very careful not to over-romanticize Islamic history. By no means was our history all glory and nor was there a utopian society. Islamic history, and I wrote an article on Islam 21C called Understanding the Caliphate, between romanticism and skepticism, right? You find some brothers and sisters from different groups of movements who oversimplify and over-romanticize Islamic history. But there were many bloodshed, there were many wars, there were many dirty politics and power struggles between dynasties that existed.
Of course, human beings have an issue of doing that. Yeah.
They were not anbiya, they were not receiving wahi. Naturally these problems were going to exist. And again, Prophet ﷺ prophesied this.
Yes, of course.
He said after the Khulafa ar-Rashidin that these things were going to happen.
Yes.
That it's going to go into kingship, that you're going to have biting tyranny, and that this polity known as the Khilafah will be gone. But he concluded by saying that it will come back.
Yes.
And it will come back upon his methodology.
Yes,
so sometimes I wonder to myself, why do Muslims ask questions when we already know these things have been prophesied?
You know what it is? One thing is...
Go on, sorry.
Sorry, no. One thing is that many instances we find Muslim youth in the West, they link their iman to history. And if something happened historically, then they think there's something wrong with their deen. But the first thing is you mentioned Rasulullah ﷺ already foretold us this through the wahy he got from Allah. That's the first thing. The second thing is, no matter what happened in history, let's just say all 1400 years were complete oppression and bloodshed from Muslim rulers, hypothetically, right? Yeah. But that still doesn't change the fact that Allah is your creator, and He sends down messenger, and He has angels, and He has the afterlife. None of that changes. So no matter what happens, our iman isn't dependent upon history or what other human beings have done. Our iman is dependent upon recognizing that Allah is our creator and He wants something from us, and that we show gratitude, right? And I know we're finishing off the whole thing about the democracy, and this is my last comment, is that in the Muslim world we saw in the last 100 years this whole concept of Demokrati Islamiyya, Demokratiya al-Islamiyya, Islamic democracy. And one of the reasons why they did that, one of the reasons why the scholars of the Muslim world did that, was to make a bridge between the Muslim world and the Western world, and they labeled it Islamic democracy, is because they saw that there were some elements in democracy that overlap with Islam. For instance, the election of a Muslim ruler is that either it's going to be a people, or the people elect a group or a a cabinet of people that are going to elect the Khulafa, as Umar radiallahu anh insisted. Yes. So for that very reason, one thing that I realize in the Muslim world is many of these scholars don't really believe in democracy of the Western democracy understanding. Rather, what they do is they want to make some type of bridge and utilize elements of democracy that overlap in Islam. But that causes lots of confusion, and I think we're dealing with that confusion now. Is that when you tell Muslims democracy, well, democracy is Islamic. What are you talking about? It's an Islamic concept completely. That's what they believe, right? And when you tell them that, even when you're about to have a discussion, they're like, oh, you're a socialist then. If you don't believe in democracy, then you're a socialist, right? Yeah. It's either or. So I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of wrap up on this point, wallahi, I'm so happy that you made that point about how many Muslims regard history as wahi, or history as
iman dependent
indicators. Yes. So I just want to read one short paragraph from the article I wrote for Islam 21C.
Please.
Called Understanding the Caliphate between Romanticism and Cynicism. So I go on to say, therefore it is not uncommon to read or hear Muslims cite examples of civil wars, rebellions, tyranny, or misapplication of Sharia laws in the same condescending tone as Orientalist and secular liberal reforms. Furthermore, it is as if the cynics among us regard historical events pertaining to the Caliphate as indicators or even evidence to what is halal and haram in relation to Islamic governance, forgetting that those who ruled the Muslim world after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ were human beings. So it's a very poignant point you made, and I hope that wallahi everyone who listens to this podcast remembers this point. What happened in history is not dalil for how we as Muslims live. History is not an indicator of what is halal and haram. We have our Islamic source texts, we have the Ijma' as-Sahaba, we have our respected ulama to carry out the qiyas on our respective texts. But historical events does not make things right or wrong, right?
Of course.
And then on this article, I go on to give examples of where internal dynastic power struggles did not necessarily mean that the basic rights of the citizens of the caliphate were not being met. So it's very important. This whole discussion about Islamic democracy and the compatibility of Islam and democracy, with respect to our scholars who carried out works on these topics, number one, they are men, but very knowledgeable men. And ultimately, as we all are, we are but products of our own society. We are but products of our environment. And it is not alien for certain ideas or prevailing ideas to influence the way we understand text or the way we understand certain ideas and realities. And when you're in a society or an environment where you are told, or you're constantly hearing that, democracy is the way forward, there is, it's the end of history as per Fukuyama, and how wrong is he, and all these kind of things. Naturally, our ulama, they are not supermen. They are equally human as us, and they can be susceptible to being influenced by these foreign ideas as well. So I think it's very important for our respected ulama who will give rulings and who do commentate on political affairs of the ummah, whether it's domestically in the West or in the Muslim majority world, I kindly beg them to understand the history of democracy.
Yes.
Athenian democracy,
Yes.
Roman democracy.
Of course. All the way from the
democracy.
linguistic level, what language does it come from, why was it
Exactly.
started, and then that'll obviously
what it means,
lead us to
how
something.
it manifested classically amongst the Greeks and how it evolved. Read the history of the Christian Reformation. Read the history of Westphalia. Read the history of Europe's struggle with the Vatican and Roman Catholicism. Read the whole dynamics of the creation of nation states. Because if you don't understand these things, how are you ever going to understand whether Islam is in contradiction or fully compatible with it?
Yes.
If you don't understand these things, your understanding of democracy or the nation state is skewed in the first place.
Yes.
Now, I heard very recently, and this is my last point on this, recently I had a respected American scholar who compared the nation state as tribes of today. And when I heard this, I was scratching my head and I was like, subhanallah, I studied politics for 3 years on a BA level. I've never heard such a thing. When you read European history and the formation of the nation state and the Christian Reformation and the teaching of Martin Luther and the Enlightenment thinkers and how all of this contributed towards the world that we see today, then we find a respected, prominent American scholar who has a huge following compare the nation state to the tribes of the time of Prophet ﷺ. I was like, subhanallah, if we're going to give these kind of analogies, be very careful of the backlash that it may have, if not in our time, but then generations to come. You cannot compare the nation-state construct to the tribes of Arabia at the time of Prophet ﷺ. It's just, that's like...
Well, Dilly, I think what you just said, it highlights a big problem among Sheikh Amr. I don't mean to offend you or your classmates or anyone, but among scholars in general, that they don't understand politics.
They don't.
Right?
I agree.
And they comment on things that are way beyond their field or what they've studied. And for example, recently a major scholar said, that the Syrian war and the American bombings that recently happened may lead to World War III. Now, can it? Maybe, but why would they allow the destruction of their civilizations happen because of Syria?
Exactly.
They would rather use the Arab world or the Muslim world as their battleground and allow those countries to devastate themselves. But
Exactly.
they'll never
Implosions.
They'll never launch nukes at their own cities that they've worked, so hard to build, and their economies eventually to collapse as a result of a world war, right?
That's a very important point, and there's a few things I want to mention. Is the first thing is that in any Sharia, Islamic jurisprudence faculty, you're going to study Islamic politics on a very Sharia level, right? It's not going to really teach you worldview today and how to apply those theories and how to apply that jurisprudence. For instance, you have Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, right? Rulership, Islamic rulership. You have Adab al-Qadi, how a judge conducts himself. What's the relationship between the ruler and the Qadi? All of that, for right now, is very theoretical, textbook. Of course, it's the Sharia, but it's not going to teach you how to manifest itself today or how to implement any of that today, which is where scholars feel that.
That's because those books were written at a time when there was an Islamic polity.
You're right.
Exactly.
Those
books were written at a time and in a context where it was relevant.
No.
Right now, we live in a completely different reality now.
And that's why even Azhar, even in all these universities, you're allowed to talk about, even use the word Dawla Islamiyya or Khilafah within the confines of the university itself. But you're not allowed to take it outside of the walls. So you can talk about it in great detail and how important it is and how big of a fard it is and how it's the biggest fard and how all of the mu'amalat and how all of the dealings of Muslims individually and as a group all depend upon these rulings. But once you take it outside of those walls, then you haven't made it theoretical anymore, and then you're going to have to suffer the consequences. The second thing I want to mention is I remember me and Sim 6 months ago with Maheen. It may have been Maheen, I can't remember, but we were discussing something. This is more for our listeners. The listener may be thinking, in this podcast, in this episode, you've discussed the word Khilafah, Khalifa, Jihad. You've discussed, with your guests at least 30 to 40 times so far, and you've mentioned these, and these have become taboo words, right, in the past 10 to 15 years. Now, I want to tell our listeners, we like to use the word hijacking, right, of people have hijacked Islam. People have hijacked this word, right, all the way from ISIS, and everyone is talking about this word. Even Western politics keeps on talking about the word caliphate. So either it's going to be Fox News that's going to be teaching the Muslims what a caliphate is, or it's going to be Muslims that are going to be teaching Muslims what caliphate is. The main reason why we're talking about this word is because we're giving Muslims the pure understanding of what caliphate is. Don't take your understanding from caliphate from ISIS, and don't take it from Fox News. Take it from Muslims. And we're trying to bring this word back because Western media is bringing this word back. So it's a sign from Allah that we have to talk about this word, and you have to give it the original, real meaning, inshallah.
I would say Muslims who are not upon the methodology, because ISIS are Muslims. We're not saying they're not Muslims, right? So
their implementation of Islam is
very
at a
extreme.
very extreme level, and some can argue that their implementation has taken them out of the fold of Islam, but
because they claim it's Allah's rule, right? Some of them may claim, some scholars claim, because they're claiming it's Allah's.
I think those are. It's an interesting conversation because what you've just mentioned there about language and certain words which have ultimately been bastardized, right? And
I love the way you say that, bastardized. Sorry, sorry, I had to marvel at that. I'm so sorry.
Sheikh Amr loves the British accent.
I love it. Yes.
Yeah, the way it's been bastardized by Western media, it appears that everyone but the Muslims can speak about Khilafah, Jihad, and Sharia.
Right?
Wallahi.
It's so horrible, man.
Every single person can speak about it, yet when we open our mouths about it, all of a sudden we get slapped with the label an extremist or radical, etc., etc. And you know what? Ownership of language, ownership of certain concepts by our detractors is a form of oppression itself. Wow. It's a form of censorship as well. So we need to be very confident and assertive when we talk about these things. And if you're not, then you need to go and do the relevant knowledge seeking to find out what these concepts mean. Because guess what? Everyone's talking about it, except you.
Exactly.
And you don't want to be in a position where you're amongst non-Muslim peers and colleagues, and they start talking about this, and you're scratching your head thinking, I've heard this word, but I don't know what it means.
Not only that, they're going to start talking about it and make you feel inferior because they know more about it than you do. And then you're going to start falling in this loop where you think something's wrong with Islam, na'udhu billah, right?
With regards to a number of anti-terrorism legislation that's taken place and a number of counter-extremism policies that have come into place in the UK in the last 15 years, one of the key objectives of these policies, so we have a policy in the United Kingdom called the PREVENT strategy. The PREVENT strategy is, it claims to be a strategy which wants to prevent terrorism.
Yeah, we have CVE.
Yeah, so ultimately, it was actually the PREVENT strategy was actually it was inspired by the American Rand Corporation's report. Also, a number of neocon think tanks that their thinking was a key player in the formation of the PREVENT strategy. And whilst they claim grandiose things like we want to prevent terrorism and prevent domestic acts of violence, etc., when you scratch beneath the surface, it ultimately is about two things: censoring political dissent of Muslims and redefining normative Islamic concepts. It has absolutely no business, and it has absolutely minimal to zero statistics and victory stories about how they've actually prevented terrorism. And one of the things that they do is that they conflate normal policing with this PREVENT strategy. The PREVENT strategy has been around for about 8-9 years, and all it's ever been has been a draconian witch hunt of prominent Muslim activists and du'at and ulama who talk about these things. And ultimately, if the British government and Western governments in general want to dissuade Muslim youth from joining the likes of ISIS, right? If they really cared, then they would allow those grassroots mainstream groups and jama'as and ulama and activists to talk about Khilafah, Jihad and Sharia and Hudud and everything else in their khutbahs without being labeled an extremist, without them being spied on. If you really cared about Muslim youth not going and being misinformed by devious groups or dangerous groups or criminal groups or whatever it may be, then allow the mainstream ulama and du'at and activists, those who have a huge influence and grassroots following, who are upon the umbrella of mainstream Islam, let them discuss these concepts. But you won't allow them to discuss these concepts. Why? Because ultimately they fear this.
Right.
Why would you allow the awakening of the largest religious minority in your group, who once at a time, just less than 100 years ago, or more, just more than 100 years ago, had a polity, were part of a civilization which existed for over a millennia, and they were ultimately at war with European Christendom for the best part of 900 years. And I know people are like, whoa, Dilly, that's a huge jump, bruv. You've gone all the way from discussing Khilafah, Jihad, to to the Crusades. It's absolutely relevant. I gave a lecture at the University of Sheffield 2 months ago on what is Islamophobia. And I had to remind the ISOC there that, brothers and sisters, do not be
ISOC
fooled.
is like the MSA, right? The Muslim Student Association.
So you guys have MSA, we have Islamic societies. Yeah. So I told them, don't think Islamophobia began after 9/11. Islamophobia began from the inception of Islam, from Abu Lahab, from Abu Jahl, from the Qurayshi leaders, all the way through to the Battle of Mu'tah, the Battle of Tabuk, all the way through to the wars with the Byzantians, all the way through to the Crusades, all the way through. It existed, and this kind of demonization, this kind of perception that the Muslims or the Turks or the Saracens were backward, were barbaric, they were Satan worshippers, the Mohammedan followers of Satan, all this propaganda that existed for about 1,000 years. Just because we're in 2018 and we're living in the existence of quote unquote enlightened liberal democratic states doesn't mean that these racist and these Islamophobic ideas still not exist. It's just that it's been far more articulated in a way which is politically correct.
Right.
Whereby certain aspects of Islam will be attributed to the medieval period, or certain things will be attributed to backwardness and dogma. Right? So, and it's interesting how these ideas are linked to the formation of policies.
Well, Dilly, you bring up an interesting point, because a lot of the criticisms that you will receive, or what we receive after this podcast, is from our own people who say that we're being Islamist, or we're like throwing labels at us and seeing how they can delegitimize anything that we said in this podcast. For an hour or so of this podcast, I guarantee you, guys, people who are influential thinkers like Noam Chomsky would say pretty much the same exact thing. And if they said it, it has way more credibility, right? Now, that explains, that allows us to come to a certain conclusion, at least in terms of how the Muslim mentality has been shaped, that, if ideas are coming from a very liberal white man who has, How does
that make you guys feel? Talk to me. How does that make you feel? That the same thing that we discussed can be spoken about by Chomsky or Esposito or Russell Brand, but they'd be like hailed and championed, MashaAllah, they've nearly become Muslim because they're talking about this. But when a group of Muslims discuss the very same ideas and come to the very same political conclusions, that all of a sudden we're radicals and on the peripheries of mainstream Islam when it comes to political understanding. How does that make you guys feel?
Well, sometimes it's like, our worst enemies are from within. It's like, I was watching you were on a panel with some British folks, with some other British folks, and talking about, like, should we be proud of British history or should we be shameful about it, right? And then it was, for the most part, pretty civil. There was that one dude, I forget his name, that was like, it's overwhelmingly positive and whatnot. But in general, it was still respectful.
Are you talking about the interview I did 3 years ago?
You were on a panel, and then they brought in Osama Hassan, and he started calling you an extremist because of the long fasts. And I was like, yo, nobody else called you an extremist, but that dude did. And even you were like, well, I got the fatwa from Sheikh Suhaib Hassan, who was Osama's dad, right? And you're like, and he's like, oh, he's an extremist too. And it's like, he was so quick to throw the extremist label, and you were like, oh, if dude is sick, don't fast, bro. Like, you know what I mean?
It is mad. That particular encounter, it was in the Ramadan of 2015. It was the BBC Sunday Morning Live show, which is one of their kind of peak time flagship shows. and we were discussing, should we be proud of British history in light of Dresden, when Britain bombed Dresden practically back to the Dark Ages. And I made it quite clear that, look, ethnically I'm Bengali, right? And just to cite one example from the origin of my forefathers, right? And that's the Bengal Famine, which was carried out under Winston Churchill. We're not even going to mention the others. Let's just talk about the Bengal Famine at all. How can you expect me, as the son of a Bangladeshi immigrant who came here to help the British economy post-World War II, when the ratio between man and woman was 1-4, you want me to sit here and talk about being proud of British history, when British history in the context of colonialism was one that included looting, raping, pillaging, and mass-scale industrial murder? Yet you want me to sit here and be besotted with the entitlement of what you perceive Britain has given to me. At the end of the day, I was born here as quote-unquote British, as James Delingpole, who was a far-right, well, I wouldn't say far-right, but he's the more kind of neocon right-wing pundit of Breitbart UK. You know, you guys got Breitbart over there, yeah? Breitbart London. James Delingpole was part of Breitbart London, a Spectator, which is like a very right-wing thingy.
Was he the guy on that panel?
Yeah, James
that was him.
Delingpole.
Okay.
The guy was like, "Oh, so where would you rather live? Syria?" That was the interview, and I said, "Look, why did you make that automatic assumption that I want to live in Syria? I'm quite happy where I am at the moment, but the discussion here is about being proud of British colonial history. I cannot be proud of British colonial history. You'd have to be dumb and ignorant to be proud of British colonial history. But to be proud, and by the way, there was one mistake I did make, because at the end of the day, you can't think that every media contribution that you do is 10 out of 10. No, you always reflect. There's one mistake I did make in that interview. The anchor asked me quite squarely, is there anything that you're proud of about Britain? And because my mindset and my psyche during that interview was all about colonial history, it came out and I said no. In retrospect, if I were to do that interview again, there were things which I am proud of Britain's contribution. Its contribution to medical advancement, technological advancement, the way the ordinary people fought against the Nazis. Yes, there are things. But if you're talking about Britain's colonial history, there's not a single thing. There's not a single thing that I'm proud of about British colonial history. And if you're going to make me feel bad because I'm a third-generation Muslim and that all of a sudden I've got a free NHS and free education, you just need to rewind some history. And if you look at history, why did my father come here in the 60s and why did his uncle and his fathers come here in the 50s? The ratio in the United Kingdom after World War II was 1 man to 4 women. There was no one to do the labour force, so they had to get people from the colonies to come do this work. So you had the first wave of migrants from the West Indies and the Indian subcontinent. Had it not been for our forefathers, that economy would have shattered, right? Your population would have been in decline. Maybe you'd have to start to legalize polygamy. Who knows? If it was 4 women to 1 man.
Snaps.
Time. Yeah.
But we have
true,
some
though, right?
I got excited.
So Maheen just wants to know.
You know, we need to understand history, man, and we need to get over this kind of mindset that we owe everything to the West, man. On the one hand, if you've got a red passport, or by the way, you know, in England amongst the subcontinent, the Asians, we call it a red passport. Yeah, we basically means a British passport. If you've got a British passport and you really perceive yourself to be a Brit, right, or an American, right, and you see yourself as an equal to John next door or Samantha next door or like any other white folk, right? How is that they're allowed to criticize their country and their government for their policies, yet we have to say chup chop? We have to remain chup chop. It doesn't make sense. Right. It doesn't make sense that on the one hand you want to be equal as the quote-unquote indigenous Caucasian folk of this land, but on the other hand, it's okay for them to criticize. It's okay for them to demonstrate political dissent, or it's okay for them to not participate to demonstrate political apathy by not participating in the general election. But when we do it, it's like, no, you're ungrateful, and this is wrong. Wallahi, this mentality needs to change.
Or go back where you came from. Then that's what they say. Go back where you came from if you don't like it.
Go back? What do you mean go back from where we came from? Okay, I'll go back from where we come from. Give back what you took and I'll go back there.
Well, no, you know who says that more? It's our own people who say that more. Our own people say that to us. It's not even,
Fine. That's fine. I will go back to Bangladesh, but give back what belongs to the region of Bengal, and I'll go back there. Pay for my family and my friends to go back. Everything that I own in this country, compensate me. Give everything that belongs to the region, and I'll go back. No problem. But you won't do that, will ya? You just want me to go back and forget everything else that's happened. Wallahi, and I say this to all the listeners. What makes your home your home? Your family, your friends, and your loved ones. Yeah? That's the way I see it. You can put me in any part of this world. If my family, my friends, and my loved ones, and for me to practice my faith freely, anywhere's home for me. But in the context of colonialism, in the context of people telling me to go back to Bangladesh or go back to the Muslim lands, I will go back. But there's a caveat to that. If you're going to have this conversation, give back what belongs to that land.
And make sure they have internet access. Broadband, preferably.
Internet access, good electricity, right? Good employment, all the natural resources, all those jewels that are stuck on Queen Elizabeth's crown. Can we have them back as well, please? Right? Give us all those things back, and inshallah we can consider, relocating. But until then, I'm happy where I am.
In America, they tell the African American athletes who kneel for the anthem, go back to Africa. I was like, yo, your forefathers dragged them over here 400 years ago on slave ships.
Do you understand?
You know what I'm saying? What the hell? As Malcolm X said, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us.
Exactly.
Right? But do you have a few minutes left to talk about Ertugrul real quick, or do you gotta run?
I'm with you guys, man. I'm with you guys for another half an hour, 45 minutes. Let's do this.
Oh, mashallah. Okay. So okay, no. So obviously, when we're talking about Muslims who are always undermining us, one can't help to think about Sadatin Kopek.
Yeah.
Sadatin Kopek.
Yeah.
Well, not just Sadatin Kopek, but there's other. I think that show also displays different modes of how people try to break down the fabric of society, right? Like people like Kurdolu, right? The brother of Suleiman Shah, who wants to take power in season 1. He really wants to be the one who is running things, right?
Spoiler alert, by the way, if you're like Amr and only on episode 3, season 1.
And one episode from season 2.
Yeah.
Whoa. Who's on season 1, episode 3?
Sorry, bro.
Sheikh Amr.
Sorry, bro.
The Al-Khari.
No. I honestly, I wish I can find the time to watch the 400 episodes. But I don't.
Recap service. So if you want me to recap 10 episodes at a time, I can do that for you. It comes at a price, though.
Yeah.
No problem, bro.
You have to pay me in Bitcoin.
Okay.
Me and Dilly are in this Bitcoin group that we just talk all day about different.
Yeah, I think Sim, you're still waiting to start season 4.
Yeah, so I'm letting season 4 kind of accumulate because I kind of get really antsy and
you like to binge.
Yeah, I like to just binge.
Yeah, so me and Imran are the same. That's exactly what I do. When the latest episodes come out, I wait for a few to come out.
Okay,
and
right.
Bam, binging.
I see. I'm actually I'm on season 4. I'm on Bolum. I just did Bolum 109.
Bolum means what?
Episode.
Volume? Yeah, okay.
I think episode 109 total.
Okay.
So, it's 109. If for Netflix viewers, that's 109 times 3, which is 327 episodes of Netflix Ertugrul shows.
No, but we were talking.
Real talk. Once you start watching Dilly Ertugrul, I know one of the major reservations that many brothers and sisters have is that how time-consuming it can be. But Imran's there, and I'm sure he'll testify to this, that once you actually start watching the show, it doesn't have to necessarily be a binge, and sometimes it has so many lessons and points of benefit for it, and it is a relatively a fictional show, and it's a show which has taken English-speaking audiences in the West and the Muslim majority world by storm. You have to understand that the Turkish film industry, whilst it is quite well known, it's nowhere next to Hollywood and Bollywood, right? But the way this show, because remember, the show is 5 years old.
Yeah.
But it's only been hyped in the last year and a half. I would say year really. Once it got dropped on Netflix, and a few people watched it and started talking about it, bam! Now everyone's got their right hand on their chest. Everyone's saying Eyvallah. Everyone's calling their wives Hatun. Everyone's wants those hats. Everyone's talking about Adalete and Kefere and all these things. And again, it's a reflection of the state of the Ummah. And what do I mean by this? At a time where I would arguably say that we are yearning for leadership. We are yearning for someone or some kind of entity to play a key role in taking the ummah out of the darkness and the plight that we find ourselves in, into a scenario where there is a level of izzah and a level of unity and a level of an honor in our religion, and to see it manifest and benefit society, both Muslims and non-Muslims. In the absence of that, such a show has really empowered and instilled a level of ghira for this religion. I know that's a huge statement I've made, but I stand by it.
No, I want to ask you something about that too. Along with that point is, do you think, just like how the Arab Spring was sparked by an incident, do you think that there is an awakening that's being sparked because of this television show in the Muslim world? Let's just say that the Ertugrul is 50% true even historically, right? Whatever the case, that's not even important right now. But the fact that those concepts are there, and the fact that it's showing lots of izzah for Muslims and how they conducted themselves, do you think that it is bringing an Islamic change amongst people?
I think I wrote an article discussing this very issue in the Middle East Eye. I also wrote an elaborated version in the Foreign Policy Journal. It's called The Revival of Ottomanism in Turkish TV. And the Foreign Policy article was entitled How Ottomanism Will Shape the Future of Turkey in the Muslim World. Now, it's very important that we also understand that perception and understanding is nearly subjective to each individual. So I can watch, you and I can watch, us guys can watch Dilly Ertugrul and extract certain lessons and themes from it. A Muslim feminist may watch it and look at Haymana and Akis and Halima Sultan and extract completely different ideas. And by the way, I'm saying this because I've read it and discussed with some people about this. A Turkish nationalist can watch Dilly Ertugrul and then take completely different lessons out of it, because of the way the dynamics are with the Ayyubi dynasty in season 1 and then in season 4.
We even have feminists here who like Dilly Ertugrul. It's amazing.
There are some sisters that I have that are on social media, and there's some sisters that I've spoken to at universities after ISOC events who have extracted feminist lessons from Dilly Ertugrul, from the behavior of Haymana, from the etiquette of Halima Sultan, the role of what's Turgut's wife's name, Imran?
Aslahan.
Aslahan, and they've extracted completely different lessons. Right? But then I had to also remind them that episode in season 4 when, do you remember what Turgut said to Aslahan? When he said, I don't want you attending the meetings anymore. Right? I don't want you attending those meetings anymore. You attend to the affairs of the women. So I told some of the sisters, how do you respond to this particular reality? So that kind of made them think, and I was like, okay, just think about it, right? But anyway, Dilly Ertugrul is one of those shows, like any other show, that different people watch it, they'll extract different lessons according to their own thinking, their own kind of mental mindset and psyche, and how they perceive world affairs, etc., etc. That said, there is undoubtedly a revival of Ottomanism in Turkish society and culture as we speak, and it would be incorrect.
Can you define Ottomanism? Can you define that?
Yeah, so the whole kind of resurgence of Ottomanism in the show. So it's not just Dilly Ertugrul. You've got Kutle Amare, you've got Peytat Abdul Hamid, you've even got Kamalis making shows like Magnificent Century, which is about the life of Khalid Sulaiman rahimahullah. So you've got so many Ottoman shows now. Such a thing would have been unthinkable 20, 30 years ago. And quite frankly, it'd be punishable by death under Kemalist rule in the 60s, 70s.
Right.
And possibly even into the early, mid-80s. So, and also this kind of, this whole discussion about bringing back Ottoman Turkish and teaching it as a syllabus in schools. And it'd be untrue, and it'd be to say that Erdogan and the AK party haven't played a role in it. They most certainly have played a role in it, but can they be exclusively and solely praised and attributed for it? Absolutely not. How can, no matter how iron-fisted Kemalism was, you cannot take 620 years of Ottoman history away from the Turks. And then if you add another 400 years of Seljuk history, that I say about 1,000 years of where the Turks were kind of like the bastions of the Islamic world, you can't take that away from 60, 70 years of iron-fisted rule. So it was inevitable that it was always going to come out. And that no matter how much Kemalist regimes and successive military juntas tried censoring this, the Turks would never ever give up their Ottoman heritage and that of the Seljuks either. There is most certainly a cultural change happening right now as we speak in Turkey, in terms of academic circles, in terms of intellectual circles, in terms of activist circles, and one which goes way beyond just the AK Party and Erdogan. But it's something which we Muslims outside of Turkey have to understand and appreciate, because it's very easy for Muslims from the Arab world, North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, as well as the Indo-Pak community. Sometimes we superimpose our experiences to the Turkish experience. You have to understand the Turks are very different. And Hussein Yilmaz spoke about this. He discussed this in the book Caliphate Redefined, the political thought in Ottoman history. It's a very good book written by Hussein Yilmaz, Caliphate Redefined, and he spoke about how Tasawwuf, Maturidi theology, how Sufism made the Ottoman Caliphate very, very distinct to that of the Abbasids and the Umayyads, and that this Turkish experience, this kind of very confident Sufism of the Turks, is something which is not the case elsewhere, even historically speaking. And we can even say that now. When I go to Turkey all the time, I've never seen a group of people who are so confidently Sufi, but at the same time, I don't see them doing some of the things that I've seen in Bengali or Indian or Pakistani circles, without going into the specifics of things which are commonly attributed to Sufi groups from the Indian subcontinent. So therefore, the way the Turks understand the Dilly Ertugrul may not be the way we understand the Dilly Ertugrul. The vast majority of Muslims that I've spoken to from the West or non-Turks, they extract the same things: Izzah, Ghira, unity, jihad, justice, and rooting out internal spies, etc. These are the main kind of core themes that you speak. But when you speak to the Turks, they talk about it from the perspective of the deep state, of the attempted coup, of the struggle with the Kurds, of Western nations trying to destroy Turkey from within, the Gulenist movement. So many Turks, they see the Ertugrul completely different. So they'll accept, yes, the themes of jihad, the themes of justice, the themes of adalet and unity, and all these things are fine. Yes, we accept, but they understand it from a very, and again, I'm basing this on the conversations I've had with a number of Turkish students and activists.
Right.
And they kind of understand it very differently. Yes, the themes exist, but we understand it from the attempted coup. We understand it from the struggle that we're having with the Kurds. We're having it from those traitors who tried to destroy our state, are in cahoots with the Crusader nations, America and the EU, etc. And that's the way they understand. I'm like, subhanAllah, we Muslims outside of Turkey don't actually see it like that. We just see it as a kind of general baseline default situation whereby we just like to see a return of that kind of reality in the modern age. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the main themes that show is highlighting is how, at least what it allowed me to understand a little bit better, was that there's people within our organizations, our community establishments who are working against us. Now, working against us, not necessarily actively, right? They have hidden aspirations that they refuse to acknowledge. For example, at a masjid board, right? I put this thing up on Facebook that there's a Kurdolu among us in every masjid board. Now, what I meant by that was that there are people who are working with us in our Islamic organizations or in any organized establishment that are either working for social benefit, but they want to be known in society, or they want to have influence in society, or there are people who are being exploited through money, because they have found an opportunity to gain money through the organization, or because these are things that are are reoccurring themes that are happening in the show. There are people who are being bought, right? There are people who are looking for power. There are people who are working as proxies for other people, right? So we have to identify these people within our organizations. And I'm not saying like go on witch hunts or anything. I'm just saying that we have to be aware and cognizant of people who are working against our general interests, right?
Interest, yeah. Look, I think it's important to obviously also distinguish between that. There are different levels of agents, right?
Right.
You've got the outright munafiqeen,
right?
And they've existed since the time of Prophet ﷺ in Medina. We know this, right? These are people who pretend to be Muslims, but they're not actually Muslim. They're only there to destroy the community and the deen from within. That's obviously that's the pinnacle of nifaq and enmity that one could have. But then you've got different gradients. You've got people who want fame, money, status, position, very egotistical, very narcissistic, and they still identify as Muslim, and they probably are Muslim, but they have these traits.
Yeah, like Ertugrul, before he dies, he says the Shahada. It's so funny. You're seeing him recite the Shahada before he gets executed. He recites. Sorry, spoiler alert. That season 1, you lost your chance.
It's okay.
He dies at the end.
Sorry.
Okay.
Oh my Lord.
So
truth be told, you should have finished season 1 by now. So I don't even go. But anyway, so obviously you've then got individuals who, and we have them in the UK as well. You have individuals who agree with certain dominant narratives peddled by the establishment, and they genuinely believe that certain kinds or types of Islam is problematic and radical and extreme. So therefore they join certain masajid board and certain committees and certain groups to try steer policies and decisions away from what we would regard as mainstream or normative. And I think Ertugrul, I know it's very difficult to say this, but what was his objective? His objective in season 1, again, for those of you who haven't watched season 1, I'll try not to go into too much detail. But one of the things he mentions, and one of the things that any kind of quote-unquote traitors or conspirators or the kind of coup attempters try in the season, is that the tribe is weak. The tribe is disunified. The tribe is busying itself with wars and fights which we can't handle. These wars and fights that Ertugrul is engaging is making us weaker. So in a funny way, they still have the interests of the tribe at their heart, if we judge it from the words that they say. But at the same time, to try and achieve what they want to do, they will then conspire with the enemies of Islam and the community and the tribe to fulfill those things. And Ertugrul, for me, personified the worst kind of traitor you could possibly have. Now, I'm going to say something which some Ertugrul fans may dislike, but I found someone else very problematic, and that was Ertugrul.
Right.
Ertugrul, and Imran, and for those of you who have watched it, if you recall, Suleiman Shah in episode 1 or episode 2 in season 1, there was a reason why he sent Ertugrul to Halab and not Ertugrul, because he sensed something in his eyes, and he sensed envy. He sensed a thirst for power amongst Ertugrul. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Everything was like I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
He told Himana that, and you could even tell that Suleiman Shah, rahimahullah, he was kind of rahimahullah to obviously the real person that existed, not the actor. But
of course.
He was kind of he was given the tarbiyah to Ertugrul to prepare him to become the Bey. And we saw the kind of shenanigans that Ertugrul got up to in season 1, season 2, right? And it was he embodied the kind of leadership that has become the mainstream within our communities today.
Right.
When I look at
that pragmatic nature, right? Everything we have to.
It was pragmatic, but very, very, very scared, very risk averse. Always thinking about problems but never really giving solutions. Has the good intentions for the tribe and the ummah at heart, but the solutions were just problematic. I find him to be a major problem. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah.
I did not find Sungur Tekin, Tuk Tekin, any of the guys from season. I found Ertugrul one of the biggest problems. to revival and unity, because he just embodied that kind of docile, dead, kind of like, how many times does Ertugrul have to be right before you have to believe my brothers upon the haqq? Like, how many times does this guy need to prove to you that, this is the way forward? We need to fight within reason. In the context of the show, of course, listeners, we have to fight for liberation. We have to fight to get what's ours. We need to oppose the enemy so they don't become stronger within our tribes. How many times does Ertugrul have to be right for Gundoglu to accept that, my brother's probably right, I just need to follow this guy? Yeah, he's very risk averse, very scared, never taken a brave stance on anything unless it was initiated by Ertugrul. Right. And whenever I see Gundoglu, he just reminds me of many of the groups that we have in our communities today, in the West at least anyway. And I'm sure that's the same in America.
Yeah, well. No, I mean, even in the Muslim world, like, how many times do we have to tell? I mean, look, when we talk about the Ikhwan Muslimin, it's not like we hate them or anything. It's like they when we give them advice on the problematic nature of gradualism, and that word in itself is a precursor to failure in your methodology, and that you're wrong in your approach, that gradualism does not work. You have to replace the establishment, the state structure. They refuse that idea, because they feel like they have to work, they have to be pragmatic, that they have to work in democratic institution. Over and over and over again, they fail, and to the consequence of all the people who die in that, like just like what we saw in Egypt, right? How many thousands of people were killed at
Rabaa Ladawiyah? There's 1,500,000, possibly more, burnt alive in tents, unarmed.
Right. So.
The whole concept of gradualism, right? And I say this for the sake of your listeners, as well as those from the UK who will be listening. And maybe if you guys had a different definition of it, please do let me know, just so the listeners understand what we mean by gradualism. If by gradualism we talk about a continuous effort, grassroots effort to awaken the Muslims by giving them dawah, by educating them and informing them of certain ideas and concepts and realities and events that are happening domestically and internationally, that gradualism is fine, right? But if we're talking about gradualism to change the status quo, and by gradualism we mean gradualism within the very system, then this is the kind of gradualism that I would humbly argue that is not prophetic. Prophet ﷺ, he had the option to join Darul Nadwa. The Quraysh invited him to their government. They said, you rule for 1 year, we will rule for 1 year. What better offer can you have than to rule by Sharia for 1 year, and we rule by the Qurayshi pagan laws for 1 year, and we'll alternate? Did you, Sheikh, did you not have that option?
Of course, and even that very much so, because that was in the heart of the seerah, but also with Bani Shayban. When Bani Shayban, Abu Bakr even said to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we're talking about if all of the iman was put on the scale of Abu Bakr, everyone from the past who was ever a believer, his iman, Abu Bakr's, would outweigh. He said, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at that instance of Bani Shayban, he said, Ya Rasulullah, just budge a little bit and listen to what they have to say. We're never going to get this opportunity again, right? And what did Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say? He said, this deen is only for those individuals who want to enter it fully. If they don't enter it fully, we have nothing to do with them.
So now, with these examples in mind, knowing very well that Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had the best offer that a gradualist in today's age could possibly have. Can you imagine, quote unquote, Islamists or Islamic political movements were said, you know what, rule United Kingdom for 1 year according to the Sharia. Bismillah, faddal, go. Rule this country for 1 year. Right? We'd think to ourselves, whoa, inshallah, maybe this 1 year, if we establish the justice of Islam, then people will want it for a second year. Maybe the whole country, or the vast majority, may become Muslim. Yet Rasulullah said no. He said no to this kind of change. He said no to this kind of thing. And that's the kind of qiyas that many scholars and even ourselves, when we read the seerah, we understand this. sometimes I will make husn al-dhan for our brothers and sisters from the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and because the way they see it as is that, look, we've been given a bad hand and we just need to make the best out of a bad hand. And it's got to a point now where I speak to some of our brothers from the Ikhwan, and they no longer see a conflict or a contradiction between the democratic nation state and Islam. There is no contradiction. That there was a time where they'd accept that, yes, democracy in its asl is haram, is kufr, right? But that discussion doesn't even take place anymore. Now it's more to do with, well, there's actually no contradiction if you think about it. We'd like to have a democratic state where Islam is the predominant religion and it's a source of law, yes, but we will still have different political parties. We will still have a pluralistic system, and we will still recognize international law and the Geneva Convention and all these kind of international laws and norms and etc. I can't marry it. And yes, Gundoglu personifies not just our brothers from the Ikhwan, but the Muslim community as a whole. It's become the predominant thinking, and that's been the case not just recently, more so after the War on Terror. But the War on Terror has been actually quite funny, because on the one hand, it's cemented that idea, but on the other hand, it's also awoken a number of youth. So Gundoglu personifies this kind of leadership, which is very risk-averse, doesn't want to take risk, doesn't want to take noble principle stances, which may, yes, result in some death and some bloodshed and some sacrifice, but inshallah, the result usually ends up being better. And he just personifies that leadership, and it's worrying, and I find it very frustrating. And wallahi, even though it was very sad, spoiler alert, guys, so block it is, even it was one of the most upsetting scenes, and I was literally in tears, in the last 2 episodes in season 2, when, Ertugrul ran for being Bey, and he paid off the other Beys with the gold that was given by Sa'ad the right? And that departure, it was so upsetting, that last hug between Ertugrul and Gundoglu.
Oh,
right?
Man, that was so powerful.
I'll tell you straight, man, and brothers, I was practically in tears, because I was in tears for 2 reasons. Number one, it was just fantastic acting, right? And fantastic acting spurs emotions. But most importantly, you're letting your younger brother go. When you saw so many examples of this guy being right, to the extent that your father even followed your brother. But due to whatever reasons you have, whatever inferiority complexes you have, you've allowed your brother to split from your tribe. And we see this in the West, and the reason why I say the West, brothers, is because obviously, whilst I know these things must be happening in the Muslim majority world, I can only comment on things which I've observed and hear about and see and read about in the West, namely the United Kingdom and of course by extension America and Canada. We need to move away from this, and I really hope the listeners who do watch Dilly Ertugrul watch Gundoglu and realize that this guy, as sincere as he may be, remember, Gundoglu's sincerity is never brought to question. Bar that right towards season 2 where he takes the gold and pays off the base to win the election. Bar that bit, his sincerity is never ever brought into question. When push comes to shove, he did more or less always fight. And he was an honest and honorable man, but his politics was all over the place.
Right.
All over the place.
Because he sacrificed his principles. Because once he sacrificed a little bit, it was an opening for him to sacrifice more later on when he ended up paying off the other Beys to win the election.
Absolutely. And these things, I hope listeners and can watch the show and extract these kind of themes and lessons and concepts and ideas. And yeah, you know what? You'd probably watch the program and think, oh, we've got a Gundoglu in our community. Oh, we've got a Kurloglu. We've got Ertugrul. Okay, inshallah. Maybe we have some Ertugruls, inshallah. But inshallah. You start identifying local people that you know, and you start identifying them to the show, which is, it's just reflective of how the show can actually resonate with so many Muslims. And of course, there's even a growing non-Muslim audience for the show as well. I mean, I went to meet the production team when I was in Istanbul in March, and I will be flying out to Istanbul possibly before Ramadan or after Ramadan to meet the cast and brother Mehmet Bozdag, who's the producer and the director of the Dilly series.
Tell them to come on our podcast, bro.
Pardon?
Tell them to come on our podcast.
I will.
Yeah, well, we talked to the
TRT
producers
team. The TRT team emailed us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we want to guess. We want to.
I sent them some videos on. They wanted some fan videos as well, and I sent them. They had like a 3-hour time constraint. Like I guess
we need something right now.
Yeah, like we need right now. So I quickly took a video of my daughter who's like a huge Ertugrul fan. She's 8 years old.
Yeah,
She's watched the seasons over and over again. She doesn't watch any other TV show out there. She only watches this show.
You'd rather have her watching Dilly Ertugrul than some of the bakwas that's been
Of course.
She's what, 9 years old or 8?
8 years old.
She was teaching me yesterday she's catching me up to date. What happened in season 1 and season 2? I was impressed.
She's teaching Sheikh Amr about the Seljuk state, how it came before the Ottoman Empire.
Not even that. His son, who's like 5 years old, is telling me about the Seljuk state. I was like, mashallah, man. Sim is preparing some historians here.
Yeah. So, yeah, inshallah. So you're going to be meeting the cast and everyone?
Yeah. So, inshallah, that's the plan. So when I went out to Istanbul on the first week of March, I was honored to go and visit the Dirilish office. Their main office is in the Asian side of Istanbul. I was accompanied by my good brother called Bilal Tonyali. Bilal Tonyali is a growing young activist and student of knowledge. And may Allah bless him and preserve him, and may we have more like him within our communities. And he has been my kind of point of contact, because obviously there is a language barrier. So I met I forgot the brother's name, and I can't actually pronounce his second name. Hussain. We call him Hussain Bey, believe it or not. And he's like the marketing communications director for the whole show. Brother Mehmet Bozdag's father is currently unwell, so please remember him in your du'as. He had some brain. It wasn't a tumor, but he had some brain issues. But the team are very, very busy. They're doing road shows and TV interviews practically every day when they're not in the village of Riva, which is just outside Istanbul, filming the series. They do always constantly doing media shows and interviews. I will most likely fly out to Istanbul to meet the cast at the film set, interview them, and have a main interview with Brother Mehmet Bozdag. Most likely before Ramadan, possibly after Ramadan. I'll keep you guys tuned, and for sure when I speak to Brother Mehmet, I will ask him to honor you guys with an interview. Inshallah.
Well, I heard Injin is coming to America in August, based on an interview he did.
The problem with Injin is that he's actually a Kemalist.
We'll ask him about the show. I'm not going to ask him about politics.
Yeah.
He doesn't talk about politics in the interviews anyways.
I knew that was coming. At some point. Look, the thing is,
they're actors, right?
Yeah, people have to understand. Look, they're actors, right? And I forgot which newspaper it was. I think it was an American newspaper. Someone asked him, has playing the role of Ertugrul Ghazi, has it changed your life? And he just squarely said, no, it hasn't changed my life. Why should it change my life? I'm an actor. I'm an actor. I get paid to play roles, right? And then I also done a bit of research, and I found out that Brother Engin Altinduzyatan, at least previously, had voiced certain opinions that were practically Kemalism. But we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that those views and opinions change, and that the role that he is playing, that it has some kind of effect and influence in the way he perceives man, life, and universe. But you have to also appreciate, brothers and listeners, that they are actors. If people knew that the vast majority of the actors in the Omar series were Alawites and Christians and Maronites, and
really? I didn't know
how does that make you feel? I mean, they're actors.
Right.
That's what we need to detach ourselves from the actual actors and the roles that they're playing and the themes and the lessons that we extract from these shows and any program or any film for that matter. Because I've had so many brothers and sisters, brother, does Brother Engin pray Salah? I goes, look, man, first and foremost, I don't know these things. If your brother prays or not is up to you. Obviously, we know that the brothers who play Doğanalp and Abdurrahman and even Bamsi, they're known to, obviously, they've made Umran and they do a lot of charity work. But the others, obviously, they are actors, man, and most likely they probably do come from very secular backgrounds. But we should make dua for them and hope that whatever role that they play changes their heart and their mindset with regards to how they perceive Turkish politics and just Islamic politics and just life in general, really. But yes, Engin Altin Duzyatan, who plays the role of Ertugrul Ghazi, had previously voiced views and opinions that are commonly associated with Kemalists. And in a recent interview, when he was asked, has the role of playing Ertugrul changed you as a person, he said no, which was quite upsetting if you fell for him.
Well,
not
again, look, it's about the message, right? And I think
absolutely. So it's important for listeners not to fall for the actors, right?
Right.
Don't fall for the actors. Just take the show as it is, extract the lessons and concepts, apply it to how it applies to our reality in the West and in the Muslim majority world, and of course tell others to watch it, because I think it's a fantastic show. And you know, I've again, I don't want to mention any names. I've heard some students of knowledge and how accurate is this show? And it doesn't matter how accurate the show is. They tell you how accurate it is. The vast majority of the specific incidents and events are fictionalized, whereas the historical chronology in where the show is set is very accurate, impressively accurate. But the whole kind of skirmishes and the dramas and the moist love stories and all that kind of stuff, that stuff's all made up. The vast majority is made up. There's only like 12 or 15 pages of history regarding Ertugrul Ghazi rahimahullah, and even then that was written by Ottoman chroniclers that came like 100 years after.
Right.
So you know, keep in mind that the vast majority of it is fictionalized. They even tell you that as a disclaimer, I believe, at the start of every episode. So there's no need to start measuring a show based on how historically accurate it is per se. But Ertugrul Ghazi rahimahullah for sure was a renowned warrior. He was a noble bey, and these things, and he laid the foundations of what was known as the Ottoman state, which was established by his son Sultan Osman I in 1299. And of course, Ibn al-Arabi did meet him. I doubt that they met in the frequency that they did in the show, but he did meet him in real life. And Sheikh Kabali as well, who also met him, who became later on the father-in-law of his son Osman. But I don't think we need to judge a show on how historically accurate it is per se, if it's given the ummah a sense of empowerment and izzah and quite frankly, even if it's just an alternative to watching trash on TV, why not?
Yeah, right. Last question, Dilly. Other than Ertugrul, who's your favorite character in the show? You can't use the say Ertugrul.
I'll be honest. There's two. Can I mention two?
Sure.
Yeah.
Haymana.
Yes.
Haymana, like, mashallah, tabarakallah. I mean, if the real Haymana was like that, I think without such a figure, the future of the Kayi tribe and even the Ottoman state, which she did live to see, I believe, or did she just passed away just when Osman, I don't know, but she either died whilst Sultan Osman was in his teens, or she did see it. Haymana personifies and embodies the kind of female leadership that is required, and that is of wisdom, that is of the compassion of a mother, the wisdom of a wife, and the experience of someone who was married to a bey. And for me, even Haymana sometimes made a few decisions which weren't in line with Ertugrul's tariqah,
right?
Especially in season 2. Yet she was humble enough to acknowledge the mistake. She sought forgiveness, she repented, and then she kind of was just like with Ertugrul all the way after she made a few major blunders in season 2. But I think someone like Haymana, she reminds me of my own mother, and she reminds me of the many brave mothers that exist within the ummah, who hold households together, who hold entire families together, who are the bridge between entire families and groups. And for me, she is one of my favorite characters.
They're the cornerstone of society, right? And when you think about like how Middle Eastern, when you look at Middle Eastern politics and things like that, and you see like, wait, how did these men come to power? These wretched people come to power? How did these people who are torturing Muslims in their own fellow Muslims in their prisons, how did these men come to where they are? It's because the woman or the mother was weak in that society. So it's so important how Haymana.
It could be that it worked the other way. So they had a Haymana type figure, but she just stood for batil.
Right.
It could also be that. Right.
Right. So it's so important that we keep our daughters strong on the deen, and make sure that our women are strong in their deen, in their ideas, and in their belief. Right.
And so absolutely, and we should always, and I'm sure we all do, and I ask our listeners, especially those who are parents, we constantly make dua for our daughters and our sisters and our mothers and our aunts and our women folk, because the current climate that we live in, because in most cases they tend to be more identifiably Muslim and more overtly Muslim, that they do face a number of backlashes and Islamophobic attacks, and for them to wear the hijab and go out in the jilbab or the niqab or just having a headscarf even, or just dressing modestly, or one which it's a real life struggle for them. For something which brothers who don a thawb and a beard may not experience, especially if you bench as much as Imran. You may not experience these things. So we should always make dua for the preservation of our women folk's deen, and especially our young daughters, because some of the stuff that's being taught in schools right now, not that of course it affects boys as well, but we naturally know as Muslim men, there's an extra sense of protection and ghira we have for our women folk, and it's part of being a Muslim man. At the end of the day, we love our women folk, and therefore our sense of protection over them is something that is paramount and tends to be far more than, let's say, our young nephews and sons. So Haymana is obviously one of my favorite characters, and I also find subhanallah, I forgot his name, Ertugrul. Ertugrul is subhanallah, he is the kind of right hand man, or in Italian Cosa Nostra terms, he's the consigliere that you need.
Consigliere,
you need him, right? And for those of you who've seen Godfather, I think it was in part one, where Pacino, he goes and he says to his brother, he goes, look, I'm going into war. I need a wartime consigliere. I don't need you. You're a peacetime consigliere. And Ertugrul personifies and embodies both peace and war. And the kind of support and advice that he gives, not just as someone who's well versed in medicine and health and sorting people out when they run well and remedies. It's the political advice that he gives. And again, spoiler alert, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 for you guys to block it, is in season 4, when there was a struggle between Dundar Bey.
Sim just took his headphones off.
Sim's on season 4. Yeah, keep going. Keep talking.
So Dundar Bey and Ertugrul Bey, and Ertugrul Bey remained firm. He's like, I am not going to let you ruin Ertugrul Bey's legacy. I'm not going to let you shatter all his hard work by selling Handi Bazar and then us migrating back to wherever we came from to unite with your brothers who ultimately, let us go. And Ertugrul Bey, that's the kind of right-hand man and deputy that you need. It's just someone just to remind you of your mission. Because sometimes those who are on a mission need reminding of their own mission.
Go ahead, Sim.
And you always need.
Not yet.
We know this from the hadith of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the best of companions are those who remind you of Allah. And Ertugrul Bey, for me, the advice and the support he gives Ertugrul, is just invaluable. And he is actually a key player in the kind of world view and the kind of state that Ertugrul is in the process of building. So those are my favorite two actors.
On top of that, Sim, take your headphones off again. Ertugrul Bey. So also he gets married, and then actually I can't say anything because he can hear me.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I was like, wait
a second. Well, I don't know why I can't get a spoiler alert, but I won't use that example. But Dilly, you know where I was going with that.
Yeah. It's good. It's good. Look, the fact that he kind of devoted his life to seeking knowledge and working on remedies and stuff like that, and it was the kind of sacrifice that many ulama and many students of knowledge did back in those days. And it's not that they remained celibate. Yes, they had slave girls, and so they did have intimacy with, but they didn't devote themselves to marriage. And there were very prominent ulama who had this lifestyle where because being married and it takes up a lot of your time, and marriage sometimes could even be a fitna for you.
It destroys your life.
And Arthur Bey, he and Bumsy was always egging him on, and then alhamdulillah he got married, didn't it? MashaAllah.
Alhamdulillah. Well, we'll wrap it up here. Dilly, how can people find out more about the work you do and your presence online? It seems like you've got a lot of interesting insights that, mashallah, a lot of brothers and sisters can benefit from. But how can they reach out to you?
Okay, so you can follow me on Twitter at Dilly Hussain number 88. That was the year of my birth, the Gregorian year of my birth.
I think 88. Yeah, you're a young cat.
Yeah, wow. That's why when I think it was Simi or someone was saying the Bosnian War, I was like, I was only 5-6 years old.
Man, I thought you were much older.
Wow. It makes me feel bad. I was an 80. I'm the youngest out of these guys, and I'm 36.
MashaAllah. I'm sure you guys are all young in heart, really. MashaAllah.
Yeah.
So listen, Twitter, Dilly Hussain 88. You can follow me on Facebook. If you can follow my personal account, that's Dilly Hussain, or I have a Facebook page called Dilly's Desk. And of course, fivepillarsuk.com. To stay up to date with the latest news, especially in the UK and Europe. And of course, you can find my articles in the Huffington Post UK, the Middle East Eye, the Foreign Policy Journal, Al Jazeera. Literally, just a simple Dilly Hussain Google check will bring up everything that you need to follow my works and my media contributions. I can't promise that you'll agree with everything that I say and I write. But I do so for the betterment of this deen and this ummah, inshallah. And if there's just one bit of advice I can give to your listeners before I part from you beautiful brothers, is that if you've made it till the end of the podcast, you may be asking yourself, why is it that the brothers chose to speak about Khilafah, Jihad and Sharia, and why were certain, if it appeared as shots at our brothers from the Ikhwan, I want all the listeners to know that first and foremost, these concepts which we discussed are part of our religion. They're part of the deen that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam came with via wahi. These are not alien concepts, and these are not concepts which we should allow any other people who do not identify with this religion to take ownership or define for us. There is 1300 years of scholarship which explain and define what these concepts are. And the reason why myself and the Mad Mamluk crews decided to speak about these concepts, because these very concepts are a hot topic. And if we don't take ownership over these concepts, then someone else will. Yes. And when someone else does that, you will be left out of the loop, asking yourself, why do I not know about these things? So these topics.
And by the way, the conclusions that we've reached, government think tanks that are like Brookings and other think tanks that are working for the U.S. government, they've reached the same conclusion. So if it makes you feel a little bit better about what we've talked about, they've already reached these same conclusions. That they know that they can't stop the eventual rise of the Islamists throughout the Middle East. That they know they can't stop it, so they just want to kind of control it in whatever way they can. But that's a topic for another day.
And Jazakallah khair for that, for putting in that reminder and disclaimer, but just the very fact that you even had to do that.
Right.
The very fact that you had to jump in there and say, look, by the way, guys, Brookings Institute or the Henry Jackson Society in the UK or the Policy Index guys in the UK and all the other neocon think tanks that exist, and the Rand Corporation, by the way, they're talking about it, guys, so it's okay for us to talk about it. It's so sad. Exactly. That we have to put that disclaimer in to make Muslims feel like, oh, it's okay if the kuffar are talking about it, and if the Muslims
exactly.
talk about it, we can talk about it. Let's move away from this. And I will leave on this statement of Umar,
because we have the same, like we said earlier, we have the same detractors within us, our own mashayikh and our own people who the people look up to for knowledge. Is like, oh no, Mad Mamluks are talking about something that is, something strange or something that we're not really supposed to talk about. Like, there's people out there who have already discussed this much thoroughly than we have in this podcast.
Of course, and they're not even Muslim.
Wow.
I just want to say two little things, brother Ikhwan, before I go, yeah? I know also there's been some statements that have been said by both parties in this podcast where we've referred to ulama. Just to make it very clear, we're not referring to every single scholar who's devoted his life to this religion. When we talk about ulama in the context of these topics, we are talking about certain kind of ulama who, for whatever reason, whether it's unintentional or intentional, out of ignorance or out of full knowledge, are perpetuating and contributing to a particular mindset which we feel is cementing and continuing this intellectual and political and leadership decline that we're currently facing. So we accept that our scholars are indeed the inheritors of the Anbiya, but that is not just a blanket hadith. They have to embody the behaviorisms, the manhaj, the way of the prophets to be the inheritors of the prophets. Sheikh, am I correct there?
Of course you are, sir.
How can you be the inheritors of the prophets if you are not like the prophets? How can you be regarded as the inheritors of the prophets if what you're teaching and what you're propagating is quite in fact the opposite of the works of the Anbiya, right? So we love our ulama, we love our scholars, we will hold them on our shoulders and we will give them izzah and honor. But at the same time, we will also remind them and will not shy away from saying that there are elements within Islamic scholarship today that are contributing to a particular mindset which is problematic. And I advise those mashayikh and those students of knowledge and those du'at that please, if you are going to comment on political issues or if you're going to extract Islamic rulings on political realities, please, I beg you for the sake of Allah, go and learn about democratic theory, the evolving of the nation state, the struggle of the Christian Reformation. Understand these things before you pass a ruling or a judgment on a particular reality. Because if you don't understand these things, then quite frankly, you're given a ruling without fully understanding or encompassing the reality and the theories and the actual history of these constructs and these theories. And last but not least, for the youth who are listening to this podcast, we are living at a very, very unique time in Islamic history. And do not be bystanders in just watching things happening and witnessing things happen. Contribute with whatever you have. If you've only got a Facebook account, utilize it with hikmah, utilize it for good. If you're able to write something. If you're able to speak to your friends and family and loved ones. If you're not confident about your religion, go and make that effort, that conscientious effort to go out and find out about your deen. Because how can you be an ambassador? How can you be an advocate for this faith if you don't know about your faith? When John and Samantha ask you about something and your face goes red and you're scratching your head thinking, SubhanAllah, why don't I know? Go and make that effort so you can be an ambassador, so you can advocate for your faith. And on the very last thing, never ever dilute this religion. There is no reason to dilute this religion. We have our framework, we have our theology, we have our aqidah, we have the framework and the limits of how we understand and make sense of things around our world. And of course, I conclude with the statement of Umar al-Khattab radiallahu anh, where he said that we were the most disgraced people on earth, and Allah honored us with Islam. And if we seek honor in anything else but Islam, Allah will disgrace us again. And that was obviously there are different variations of that statement of Umar al-Khattab. So please, remain strong in your deen, seek knowledge, remain firm, be a proud Muslim. And there's no need for you to be apologetic. There's no need for you to be scared. There's no need for you to have fear, because these are from shaitan. And we're living at a time where we need more Ertugruls, more Salahuddin Ayyubis, more Saif Qutus, more Aurangzebs, more Khawlas, more Khadijas. We need more of these people. We don't need less of them. We need more of them. And I pray that those attributes of those great figures I've just mentioned, amongst many others, there's some of their attributes and characteristics in every single one of us, inshallah.
Inshallah. Barakallah feek, Dilly, real quick, do you like Bengali food?
I do, yes.
Oh, I guess I'm the odd one out. I'm looking for some allies and like
Whoa. Let me say something though, and this is gonna be very controversial. I don't eat fish as a Bengali.
Yeah, so like maybe it's a select. Well, that's the thing. Everyone talks about fish biryani. I've never had it. I've never heard of it. I've never seen it anywhere.
Food. I love Bengali cuisine, but I don't like fish because the smell of fish and the fear of getting a gosa, a bone stuck in my throat, just scares me. Right?
We talked about this last night on another podcast, actually.
Mahin had a bone that got stuck in his tongue.
I love it.
Yeah, when I was in 5th grade, when I was like about 10 years old, I had a bone stuck in my tongue for a week.
Yeah. Oh my days.
You know,
and also when Bengalis get a bone stuck in their throat, the remedy is banana and rice.
right?
I've done that. Yeah, I was eating it.
Banana and rice. But just to tell you listeners something about myself, I had a bit of a naughty habit. I used to love bun and shabari, yeah?
Yeah.
I used to love it. Guys, when I mean I used to love it, I used to eat it after every meal. To the point where, you know what, maybe it was a bit of an addiction because sometimes I used to go sleep and not brush my teeth and have bun in my mouth. I know that's a bit sick, yeah? But I thought I just when I got married, my missus said to me, you're appearing on television and stuff, and your teeth's just red, and it's not nice.
Oh man,
I love it.
It's quite grimy, and you need to stop it. And I was like, subhanallah, it took my wife to tell me, look, you're coming on TV and something, your teeth's blood red. Stop that. So I made a qasam and I made to her that I'll stop. But do you know who the main person who gets me back on it? My mother-in-law.
Oh, really? That's funny.
Man, you know what, brother? I really don't say too many guests, especially after one meeting. But man, we all love you for the sake of Allah, man. You are an awesome brother, inshallah. We hope to meet you in person and to spend some time from you and spend some time with you and benefit from you. Honestly, just this one conversation after the first 15 minutes, our love, I think my love for you has grown so much as a Muslim brother, man, honestly.
And this guy, he don't say that about everybody, too. There's only like a few handful of guys.
Don't mean I don't love people. It's just not easy for me to say that.
Like usually, like Dr. Muhammad Gilan, I know he's mentioned that, but very rarely does Sheikh Amr give that kind of compliment at the end of the show. Like he's gonna be like raving about you.
Oh yeah,
my dear brothers. And wallahi, if there's ever a reason you guys come to the United Kingdom, I will be the first to host you in my house.
And you are going to be the first one we call. I'm guaranteeing you that right now.
And if there was any mistake for the listeners and for the Sheikh himself, if there's any mistake that I made, it was from me alone, and any khair and any good was from Allah. And if there's anything that I said, anything pertaining to the deen which was out of place or anything, again, the mistake was from myself. And any good was inspired by Allah alone. And I want you guys to remember me in your du'as. And when I come down to Chicago or where you guys are, I'll be coming and hollering at you guys soon, inshallah.
Please.
Yeah, inshallah. We'd definitely love to host you.
All right, for our listeners.
Tough love, look after yourself.
Absolutely. For our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments, you can email us at themadmamluks@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook. We're on Instagram. And give us a 5-star review on iTunes. You can subscribe on iTunes, Podcast Addict, or Stitcher Radio. And also, we are on YouTube. You can listen to the shows on YouTube. Not enough. We need more followers on likes on YouTube, right, Sam?
Yeah, on YouTube, so that we're close to 1,000, and I think once we hit 1,000, we can start exploring the idea of actually putting these episodes on video. So
right, but a lot of people have been asking about us going like having video feeds and whatnot. So,
but Mahin has to control himself.
No, anyways, that's not happening. They want to see unfiltered everything. Anyways, for our special guest Dilly Hussain, and for my co-hosts Sheikh Amr Saeed and Sim, this is Mahin signing off for the Mad Mamluks. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair.